welcome you to our webinar, and thank you for attending Best Practices for System Implementations. Balance your resources, time, and technology for success. Our speakers today are Dan Weger and Lynn Waldron. Dan is a certified project management professional with over 9 years of experience working in a healthcare IT setting. Dan has led successful implementations for EHR upgrades, electronic physician workflow, interoperability initiatives, and meaningful use stage 1 and 2 attestations. Lynn has worked in the healthcare IT environment for more than 30 years and has been with Array Software for 23 years, supporting their well-known task tracking applications, Task Plus and STREAMTASK. And now I will turn it over to Dan and Lynn.
Thanks, Lauren, and good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start today's session off with a simple question. Have you ever implemented a system, application, or even an EHR only to find out that after your go live, you didn't meet the expectations of your clinicians and user community? Well, you're not alone. As you see on the screen, KLAS published a finding last year that only 30 to 50% of EMR implementation projects failed to deliver their users' expectations. Does this image of frustration look familiar? Well, our patients and clinicians cannot afford to have this high failure rate with our system implementations. In today's session, we'll review some of the most common reasons for failure and how you can mitigate them to ensure this doesn't happen to your organization. We'll cover several general recommendations that apply to all implementations, as well as several specific examples such as EHR migrations, smart pump integration, HL7 interfaces, and test plans. We have a lot of information to cover, including several real-life scenarios, but don't feel too overwhelmed. We'll send you a copy of the presentation so that you can review the hyperlinks, success stories, and supporting documentation offline. Our goal today is to ensure that you have more successful implementations in the future. We've identified 6 main categories that can negatively impact the success of an implementation. Most of our organizations spent the last several years chasing the regulatory side of our industry. Things like meaningful use, quality measures, MACRA, MIPS, these are just a few. However, they all led the requirements of our strategic plans. We needed to implement the appropriate technology that ensured our organizational compliance, but also prevented financial penalties. With limited time, funding, and resources, we shifted away from doing thorough testing and efficient implementations really to just hastily getting the certified systems in place. Our mission was simple: meet all requirements by the imposed deadlines, no matter what. In hindsight, how many of us actually took the time to stop and solicit input from our clinicians? Did we create processes that just met the regulations? Or did we actually utilize the technology in a way that directly improved patient care? Throw in the fact that many hospitals were faced with impossible timelines, unfamiliar challenges, or even little to no project oversight, we ultimately created the perfect storm for post-live nightmares. Instead of promoting more efficient workflows, many clinicians even balked at the change. I saw firsthand that physicians resigned when CPOE became a mandate, and those that stayed just continued to lose interest in the paperless system. The common feedback received was that the providers just felt like they were being pushed into using functionality simply for the reason of collecting data. But now that the dust has settled, what can be done to restore your clinicians' confidence and get back to improving patient care? Well, today, we'll review 4 key areas in detail to ensure that you are successful with your future IT implementations, starting with project and program management. And just as a reminder, we will send out the presentation so that you have the content and the links to our success stories and other relevant documentation as we go through the presentation. It should go without saying that the complexity of a project is going to dictate the level of project management required. Some projects are fairly straightforward, while others may require balancing hundreds of tasks, several teams of resources, and really just keeping all hands on deck performing their normal day-to-day activities. Regardless of the project scope, this balancing act can only be performed by an experienced project manager, and especially one who utilizes a structured project delivery framework. That framework should include various plans such as risk management, issue mitigation, and definitely a project schedule that will ensure that the completion is being completed as planned. But organizations don't always consider other aspects of that framework. Things such as your documentation, reporting, or even the analysis of those items, and most importantly, communication. If you don't document or report an issue, it's never going to be investigated. Similarly, a project schedule is useless if you never analyze the current activities and compare them to your projected baseline. And as we said, most importantly, communication is key for the success of any implementation. An experienced project manager will coordinate all of these activities on your behalf. That will enable you and your team to focus on the things that matter most, like taking care of your day-to-day activities. That way you can take care of your patient care delivery and improve it as necessary. Diving into the project schedule, you're going to want to include several testing events. Each will have its own scope and purpose, but normally you'd start out with some basic level of testing that really just ensures your day-to-day workflow hasn't been compromised. Once that's complete, you move on to a more detailed testing event that Lynn is going to discuss in just a moment. But first, I wanted to talk to you about one of our real-life engagements where they found success using all of these practice recommendations we just covered. Upper Chesapeake Health System in Maryland was undergoing a Meditech 615 upgrade. They had already included application and interface testing events, but decided to add two very formal testing events that included really their IT analysts, their department super users, and other hospital teams like nursing, pharmacy, lab, radiology, health information management, and their finance team. It was just the whole spiel. Our team managed the testing events and utilized a web-based application called STREAMTASK that allowed them to document their issues, track their mitigations, upload screenshots, and ultimately get real-time testing statuses and reports sent out to the project team. Having a formal testing event, especially a web-based application, also allowed us to bring in resources at the appropriate times for their testing activities. We certainly tried to schedule coverage for everyone's shift, but the reality was it just couldn't happen that way. So if it didn't work, we just paged them or called them when it was their turn to do testing so that way they can complete it in between their clinical duties. As a great example, we had several physical therapists who saw some patients, were paged to do testing, ran out to a computer on the unit they were at, finished their testing activity, and then just went back to their next patient without really compromising any of their patient care. The most important thing, patient care wasn't compromised, as we just mentioned, but even testing was installed. And as an added bonus, the Upper Chesapeake team used their testing notes at the end of this event to create an implementation checklist. This allowed their team to ensure that all necessary steps leading up to their implementation were completed before their main event. But for further information regarding testing practices, I'll turn it over to Lynn.
Thanks, Dan. Well, I'm one of those people who likes to put testing and organizing into the same sentence, as radical as that might seem. So one of the things that I like to start with is, as much as you possibly can, prepare your testing environment in advance. There's certainly lots you can do ahead of time before things get really crazy. So, for example, determine where the testing will occur. Will it be distributed or virtual? Will there be an option for a reserved training room with PCs for users to test away from their usual work environment? Will some testers be working remotely? It's never too early to get all of these particular issues worked out. It's also never too early to start to establish your testing documentation guidelines. How much documentation is enough? This is something that I think all testers struggle with, and it's time consuming to do the testing, but it's also time consuming to document what you tested. So I think it's really important to instruct your testers, give them some good examples of what is adequate documentation, especially when you know that Joint Commission might be coming in to take a look at your testing documentation. The next step is to start to really clarify how issues are going to be identified and communicated. Regardless of where your testers are, there needs to be a centralized way to track the progress and document testing results and issues that arise. So for example, look at your process. Stand in front of a whiteboard with markers and really talk about how we're going to move information around and you know, as it goes from one person to another, and at what point do priorities and statuses change. So for example, answer the question, if you can, who validates that there's a software versus a user error when you're testing? Does the tester have permission to get help from someone in IT to kind of look over their shoulder and say, hey, is this really a bug, or is this something I'm doing wrong? Who opens a ticket or a task with your vendor, your HCIS vendor? So again, you need to be clear. Not all testers necessarily have the permissions to do that. So who is going to open that ticket, and how is that going to be communicated, again, among the team? Also important to educate your testers about prioritization. What makes an issue a showstopper, and who's going to make the decision that a problem is so severe that you're asking your vendor to put all hands on deck to get it resolved? The next sort of category of preparation that you can be doing is making sure that you include a good mix of users and skill sets. So if you can, you want to utilize both experienced testers and super users who may be very knowledgeable in their application but not very experienced with testing. That's a good complement to work with. So the less experienced testers will need to be encouraged to break their module, and I always see the shoulders go up when I teach that in a class. It's like, what do you mean break my module? But it's really important to give your testers permission to misbehave in the module, and if it's going to break, you want it to break during the testing phase of the project. So you really want to encourage them to stress the functionality. The next thing is to take that testing and really look at different levels of testing. So I like to think of sort of 4 levels of testing. The first one is sort of the granular testing, where you're looking at individual changes in certain modules, and you may not do that in all applications or all projects, but there are situations where it's important to look at the very individual changes and make determinations about the impacts of those changes on your organization. The next level up in testing would be something we sometimes refer to as functional testing or workflow testing. This could be an isolated routine within an application, such as transferring a patient. The next level up would be, you could think of it still as a workflow, but it's more integrative. You're taking a patient from beginning to end, from their entire visit, from being registered and given an encounter number, and then all of the various stages, the care that they're given, and movement around the organization and documentation. So sometimes that's referred to as sort of integration testing. And then another, maybe not higher level, but a sideways level, is testing interfaces with your third-party applications. So that's also an important thing that, again, ahead of time, you can be identifying all of your third-party applications that need to talk to your main EHR, and who's responsible for testing those interfaces, and how is that going to be tracked. Next, it's a good time to develop these detailed scenarios, and again, this can all be done ahead of time. A good place to start is to work with your application experts, your super users, and identify the critical workflows in each of the applications or departments. And then work with your super users to create step-by-step testing scripts or test cases. And you can make those test scripts as detailed or as general as you want, again, depending on the expertise of your tester. So that's something that we spend a lot of time, advising people about. Ideally, these test cases can be easily replicated so that you want to have a situation where you can take that detailed step-by-step test case and perform it, and then if it fails partway through because of a software issue, you basically fail the entire test, and then you relaunch a new version of that once the error has been corrected, and you perform that entire script again. So those are all things that you can be working on ahead of time. Also important to allow time for mitigation before you actually go live. So you can, in talking about those different levels of testing, make sure you set clear target dates for these different levels so everybody kind of knows what they're working toward. Don't put the same target date on every single task. Obviously, if certain things need to be done ahead of other things, you want to give yourself that buffer for getting things fixed and then retesting. Because just because you've tested something already, if you fix something that could have an impact in that area, you're going to have to retest, and you certainly want to do that. Next, it's really important with all of this work that you're doing to record the outcome of everything that you're doing. So however you're choosing to record your testing results, good or bad, you want to make sure you have some kind of a tool that will allow you to compile summary statistics, you know, percentage complete by application or by tester. It tells you whether you're on track. I mean, you're working toward a live date, and how are you going to know that you're going to make that live date? So it's really important to have a tool that allows you to get some metrics. The testing tool should also allow you to track what we call custom fields. And I refer to those often as go live issues, such as I do work through testing a change or an enhancement or some critical workflow, and I realize that because of a change in that flow, retraining is going to be required for a certain job title in the organization. Or, gee, I realize there's some things that we're going to have to do on the live day that we can't do ahead of time. And how am I going to track all of these go live issues so that the live day is not chaotic? Are there going to be documentation changes? Is my downtime documentation going to have to be updated because of a change in a workflow? So these are all things that you would want to be able to track in some kind of a tool that allows you to compile that information, search on it, report on it. And also, it's important to remind your testers as they do this documentation that they are the best positioned to evaluate the effect of a workflow change on the organization. They really are the linchpin, and I think it's important to remind them of that. When they study a change, and they study a change in a workflow and they test it thoroughly, they are the expert at that point, and they need to be encouraged through a structured software to sort of say, okay, how is this going to impact my organization, and what do I need to communicate to the rest of the team that's going to make this as smooth a go live as possible? So that's really important. And lastly, it's important to incorporate all these outcomes that your testers have so carefully indicated into the cutover plan. So the cutover plan is going to, have the to-dos for the go live day. It's going to have the training plan. It's going to have the documentation update plan. If you have, for example, a training coordinator, that person has to be able to query the database or the testing tool and pull up all of the activities where someone said, you know what, because of this change, we really need to do retraining. That's very important for someone like a training coordinator. And then, what are the to-dos for the actual live day, for the day before the live day, the day of the live day, and maybe the day after. So there are probably things that are phased. So I could go on, but I'm going to stop there with my thoughts on testing. Over to you, Dan.
Well, thanks, Lynn, for that great insight. Per our best practices, we recommend performing a current state workflow assessment as one of the first steps in your implementation. During this process, you'll meet with the departments that will be impacted by the new technology, but your goal really is to understand their current workflow process and also to evaluate the new technology. Once you take place and do that evaluation, you'll want to inform them of any potential changes that may occur. Really, we recommend that instead of forcing adoption of these new processes and workflows or functionality, that you just try walking through it with them, as a cohesive unit. The goal really is that you want your clinicians to truly understand what the change is going to entail, rather than just forcing them into that change. In your discussion, you may even find that the technology or workflow changes may introduce brand new solutions to problems that have not yet been identified in the implementation. But more importantly, you can incorporate your stakeholders' opinions. You can really empower your users by evaluating opportunities that improve their day-to-day workflow. Immediately, you'll notice that you're going to gain their trust and their buy-in, and they're just going to feel as though they have the ability to make a positive change in their department. And when that happens, they'll become more interested and more engaged in the project, which is going to give you the opportunity to dive even deeper into your analysis. The new workflow and the technology that you discover is going to guide your testing events because you'll create those scenarios to vet out those processes as part of the testing session. Perhaps one created a new issue? Well, without user engagement, you might not have caught that before the implementation. This is one of the processes we utilized in an engagement at Matagorda Regional Medical Center. Our team conducted a workflow optimization assessment within their cath lab department. We had lots of discussions with their team members, and during those discussions, we quickly identified multiple processes where they were double and even sometimes triple documenting in non-integrated systems. Instead of letting them continue those processes which worked, we strongly recommended building an interface between their EHR and cath lab system to eliminate that duplication. It created a new project with its own set of requirements, but in the end, the benefit was not only noticed by the department, but most importantly, their patients. By not having to do the double documentation process, nurses discovered they had more time to attend to their patients. That way they're able to spend more time alleviating any pre-procedural anxieties or concerns that the patients had. And in the end, noticed that they actually had happier patients. And with happier patients, they were able to complete the procedures faster. But most importantly, they had a greater level of patient engagement and care. As seen in the cath lab at Matagorda Regional, it's no secret that humans resist change. Whether it's a new workflow process or a brand new EHR, or just someone took your normal parking space on that one day you're running late to work, right? Any implementation is going to introduce change. It's just part of our human nature, but that change may cause anxiety or generally worry your user community. The best way to mitigate those concerns is to be proactive with communication. Keep the impacted departments and clinicians in the loop. That way they feel more involved in the process, and just like we just talked about, they feel more invested in the project. The trick, though, is knowing how and when to reach them. Back when I was still working in the hospital, we had a certain group of patient caregivers who just never logged into their email. Clearly sending them any update of an implementation through email wasn't going to cut it. But instead, we were able to publish key milestones and current state assessments in public areas such as the intranet site, newsletters, screensavers, and even some signage outside the cafeteria. Basically, we identified that they didn't want to communicate through email, but were able to eliminate that barrier simply by communicating in another way. For the larger projects, you may even need to consider multiple methods for your various teams. Such items could include posters, videos, training material, or even my personal favorite, just lunch and learn sessions where you do an education session during their lunch break. Ultimately, it can turn into an entire marketing campaign. The key, though, is that you have the unique opportunity to truly engage your organization and to have some fun with it. In case you couldn't tell, I'm the goofball in the office, so I'm always looking to have fun at work. A communication plan should be no different. If you have new menus or applications that you're going to have after the go live, try sending out a crossword puzzle or word scramble through email. This will not only allow your users to become more familiar with the vocabulary, but it prevents them from having to sit through an entire formal training session as well. For an upgrade or a migration, maybe a scavenger hunt throughout the hospital is more relevant. You could have each department join in by having a special sign posted in some non-critical location of their department. The sign itself could contain new processes or, how they impact other hospital departments, or even just general fun facts about the new technology being implemented. The key, though, is that the hunters have to find that sign in each department. And perhaps, at the end, as an incentive, maybe throw a pizza party for the department that completes the scavenger hunt first. The goal is to really use communication to relay implementation updates and to just keep everyone in the loop, but ultimately use it as a tool to engage everyone in their project activities. While all of those general recommendations can apply to every implementation, we also have several tips and tricks for some unique project implementations that you either have or will come across in the future. In fact, all of you completed a questionnaire during the registration process. Based on that feedback, we've organized this section to cover the information that you guys wanted to hear about. We received an overwhelming number of organizations interested in EHR migrations and upgrades, so we don't want to keep you waiting any longer. We'll go ahead and we'll start right there. EHR upgrades and migrations are complicated. No matter the vendor, there are going to be hundreds, if not thousands of tasks to complete, teams of resources, and various project deliverables to coordinate. To be successful, you must have a strong project team. That team is going to consist of sponsorship from all of your key departments, but should also include at least one executive. These sponsors will work closely with the project coordinators, the project managers, and ultimately the program manager to provide an oversight, resources, and support for the migration. An experienced program manager will build key milestones into the project timeline. These events could include code delivery, third-party integration, testing events, mitigation time, go-live readiness assessments, and definitely your implementation and post-live support activities. Unfortunately, most hospitals struggle to have enough resources for their day-to-day operational activities and to complete their project work. It really comes down to the program manager. It's their responsibility to know what work with each of the departments to obtain the resources for their project activities. Like with a testing event, they should have multiple resources so that the testing can continue, even if one of those individuals is called away for an issue elsewhere. Not only does this prevent any unnecessary delays in testing, but it just keeps the project moving forward. Another piece of advice is you should also include multiple milestone checkpoints throughout the project implementation. We call them Go-Live Readiness Assessments, or GLRAs, but they're typically performed between 120 days and 30 days between implementation. The assessment gives the project team a formal checkpoint to ensure the project is running on schedule and is going to conclude as planned. And if not, it gives the team advance notice to mitigate any issues to return the project back on track, or even to simply notify stakeholders of a potential change in timeline. To relay the advice from our friends at Array Software, the goal of testing is to break the system prior to go live. While it may sound strange at first, it makes perfect sense if you think about it. Testing is the period of time that your IT analysts and user community get a chance to replicate their workflow with the new system. Not only does this allow them to learn any new workflows, but it validates that their process will work after implementation. And if not, gives the team enough time to mitigate the issues so that the majority of your user community is not negatively impacted after the migration. Just as we were able to do at Upper Chesapeake Health, we recommended incorporating multiple testing events. Lynn mentioned a few slides ago that each event has a different purpose. When we did the integration testing round, we focused more on system integration. We wanted to make sure that if a user clicked the button, they were advanced to the appropriate application screen, or certain reports generated, or barcode labels were printed. But once the system level was validated, we moved into a more detailed testing event. It was called parallel testing. Some other vendors like to use terminology, user acceptance testing. But basically, we replicated live patient visits in their new test environment. In the parallel testing event, we found numerous issues that would have compromised their implementation. but by identifying and mitigating those issues prior to go live, they had one of the smoothest upgrades to date. 0 issues were reported during the entire 2-week 24/7 support window. And that actually brings up a great final point. Once you have completed the upgrade, you need to stick around. You have to support your user community at least 1 to 2 weeks after go live. If you think about it, this is most likely the largest implementation your organization will ever experience, and it needs to be treated with that level of care. When we're hired to coordinate the command center, we build a team of super users and IT analysts that have a role of just dedication to supporting the impacted departments. And typically we do 24/7 coverage for a 2-week period after the go live. Behind the scenes, this just makes sure that everyone continues to move forward with the new workflow, and in doing so, increases user adoption. It also has the added value of giving your IT team a visual presence throughout the facility. It allows your users to feel more comfortable, and while they feel more comfortable, they're more readily available to use the system in a way that identifies any issues that might need an immediate resolution. But as a bonus tip, make sure you do have food and beverages on hand for your support team. It's just a small gesture that goes a long way when supporting a customer base 24/7 continuously for a week or two. And as our last piece of advice, we strongly encourage you to take these points to heart. We've seen time and time again in our recovery projects that failing to complete these events really has a domino effect, leading straight to an implementation disaster. Now, for those of you that were interested in or considering smart pump integration projects, you'll want to ensure you understand the hardware requirements and the impact it will have on your clinical workflows. One smart pump device we have worked with uses a unique patient disassociation process. In other words, the nurse needs to perform specific actions in order to remove the patient's demographic information before that device is used to administer infusions for a patient in another room. So if you're administering infusions on Mickey Mouse, you would need to disassociate the device before administering infusions on Donald Duck. As you may imagine, failure to follow that process correctly would result in huge medication risks going from patient to patient, and ultimately would be leading to an adverse patient event. Since smart pump programming is so critical to patient care, you absolutely need to perform a live testing event. Often called a pilot, this event could be completed for a particular patient room, a nursing unit, or even a collection of nursing units. In the pilot, a clinician would complete an infusion start to finish using the new technology like the hardware, the software interfaces, and so forth. This really is going to allow them one final opportunity to vet out any technical barriers that cannot be discovered in a simulation or a testing room. They're typically set up differently than the real show or the real live areas. But just like we talked about, proactive communication is key in your patient engagement. Be sure to speak to the nurse manager and the patients before conducting the events because you certainly don't want to catch them off guard. But lastly, to get the most bang for your buck in a smart pump integration project, we'd recommend that you consider a bidirectional integration. Medication orders from Meditech can be sent to the smart pump device, allowing for a more automated administration process. Essentially, once the nurse selects to administer the medication from the EMR, the order detail is delivered to the smart pump. After a final validation of the administration criteria, the nurse will then enable the smart pump to start the infusion as ordered. During the infusion, however, the smart pump device generates event messages. These events contain tons of information like patient demographics, start and end times, infusion volumes, medication data, and just general information about the device. But this data can be delivered back into your EHR, which could provide an additional clinical value that your providers didn't have in their prior paper workflow. There really is a lot to consider when taking on a smart pump programming integration project, so be sure to plan ahead and consider the risks. And for those of you that are on Meditech, Iatrix Systems is the only smart pump integration partner for all 3 platforms, so definitely take the time to check us out as you're interested. Speaking of integration, Health Level 7 or HL7 interfaces are really one of those few on-off implementations we can perform in our industry. Such implementations are commonly referred to as interface cutovers. And we on the professional services team recommend that you complete all of your implementation activities before your cutover. While this doesn't necessarily make sense in other projects, HL7 interfaces function just slightly different. Interfaces are not officially live until both ends of the communication tunnel are actively talking to one another. The best way to think about it is that there's a sender and there's a receiver. As the name implies, the sender is the one sending information from one system to the receiver. If either the sender or the receiver are offline, that just means the HL7 messages cannot be delivered. When coordinating the cutover, though, we can use this to our advantage. For example, you can keep the sending side off while we continue to work to establish, connectivity or even delivering the interface code into the production environment. Things such as moving the custom filters and tables and routing rules before the cutover also allows you to just simply turn the interface on at the agreed upon time. And once that happens, you can immediately begin monitoring the message transmissions. At that point, you really can just make sure that the data is communicating as it's supposed to between both systems. This process allows you to more readily coordinate interface cutovers with those involved. Depending on the interface, you could have providers, various hospital departments, ambulatory practices, multiple vendors, so forth. And really on that note, some EMR vendors require that a complete system downtime has to occur in order to prepare for their end of the communication tunnel. Realistically, while you may not have full control over that part of the implementation, you can coordinate the best time for all involved teams. And if you give them a chance to ask, most always you'll find that they prefer to schedule an off-hours cutover since it minimizes any impact to their day-to-day workflow. But in order to prevent your staff from working off hours, you could simply turn your end of the interface on before the vendor does. This will allow messages to queue and just start to build, and they'll be delivered as soon as communication is established with the vendor. And at that time, you're either going to find that messages are immediately transmitting between systems, or right away you'll identify some sort of connectivity-based issue that needs your attention. And that brings up a great last point. Although the interface cutover is fairly straightforward, it's usually the result of a highly skilled and experienced integration engineer. It's the person that's doing the work during the implementation phase that really makes the post-live successful. There's really no exception to the rule. I'd challenge you to think of it this way. What if you had a family member that had an extremely rare, complicated disease? Would you rather have them treated by a medical student or a premier specialized physician? Well, honestly, I know my answer. And in the context of projects that I'm running, I choose to have the engineers with the experience. When you run your projects, I'm sure you have favorites as well, right? You might have somebody in your department that has 20 years of experience. You might even have somebody with just one. Well, if it's an option, I'm going after the 20-year engineer every time simply because they're the ones who can fix any issues on the spot and really just get your team back on track as necessary. Ultimately, at the end of the day, they're just great resources to have. You see at the bottom of the screen, there's a link to a success story we mentioned, but in one of our engagements in Matagorda Regional Medical Center, this almost exact scenario happened. Matagorda Regional is a very small rural hospital in Bay City, Texas. They have a small IT team, but they definitely had some prior integration experience. But after stalling for several months and realizing that they did not have the necessary skills or time, they actually decided to contract our team to assist with their integration effort. We built, customized, completed testing, and delivered their ADT interface start to finish in a total of 19 days. And although that's a nice time, more importantly, there have been no issues reported for this interface now 6 months after implementation. Although they chose to use a third-party integration engineer, their clinicians immediately realized the benefit of using an experienced individual that got it right the first time. They simply went live and have had no issues since. And before I turn things back over to Lynn, let's just go back to a couple of the stories we've shared in this presentation. Their successful, no issues implementations were directly tied to their testing efforts. Testing should never be neglected in any project. But due to time, resources, and experience, many hospitals choose to skip this step and just fix issues later. I've heard tons of hospitals who just say, oh, we don't need to test, we'll just move all of our code into live and fix issues later. Well, I really can't stress this enough. You don't want to deal with issues that have a major impact to your user community after your go live. And the best thing your organization can do is to prepare and to take time to develop a formal test plan. This will create a structured framework that can be utilized to manage the testing events that's going to ensure you remain successful and meet all objectives outlined in the plan. And every project should have one of these formal test plans, which is going to outline how you'll perform the testing, the necessary resources involved, and the scenarios that are going to be tested. When you start to develop those plans, Lynn talked about it a little bit earlier, but you want to make sure you include resources that are familiar with both the technical and the operational perspectives of the workflow. For example, you may want to partner a super user, somebody like an IT analyst who really knows the application inside and out and how it integrates on the technical level in the back end. But you're going to want to pair them with someone who performs the work daily. So someone who might be less tech savvy, but works in the department and uses the application from a user perspective each and every day. By combining those two skill sets, you'll get a more conceptual overview of the testing that really needs to occur. And that way, you can ensure whatever new system or interface or whatever else you might be implementing isn't going to compromise the workflow that exists today. But regardless of that skill set, the test scenarios need to be developed to provide the tester with a step-by-step plan of action. The testing resource should be able to offer assistance when developing these scenarios, but it ultimately must be reviewed by an individual or a team. That team should have a better integrated understanding of the system and operational workflow, so it might consist of several IT analysts or several super users or several department leads and so forth. And when you create the scenarios, you must include an expected outcome in your scenarios. This is the only way to let the tester know exactly what was supposed to occur in that testing step. It really gives you a gauge that allows you to see how far off from the end state you are, or maybe you're lucky enough that you aren't and you're ready to go to the next implementation phase. When we engage with a site, we spend a good amount of time working with the department leads to review and to understand their current workflow. As we discussed earlier, this time spent really allows us the opportunity to evaluate the changes and improvements that build the comprehensive testing scenarios. Your goal should always be to replicate real life in your testing as much as possible, because it's the only way that you're going to find issues before go live. And the great thing about the test plan is that you can usually reuse or repurpose them, with minor adjustments from project to project, moving forward. You really just ultimately increase your chances for successful implementation by having at least one test plan. And if creating this detailed plan seems overwhelming, I'm not going to lie to you, it most likely will be. If creating this is where, it really just ties back into the other topics we've discussed. You need to plan ahead to identify who can perform these tasks. And if you're having a hard time doing that, maybe you need to bring in some extra help for someone to help walk you through that process, or even just assist you. But although it can be an overwhelming task, there are many tools available to assist your team with developing the structured testing framework, such as Array STREAMTASK.
Thanks, Dan. I'm just going to take a minute to talk about some highlights of the STREAMTASK application. Any software vendor will tell you that we're very grateful when our customers and our partners put our software to such good use. And we get so many great ideas from our customers and our partners in terms of continuing to improve our functionality. So briefly, the application is browser-based, accessible anywhere, lives on a server in your environment, is very scalable to any project size and number of users. The design of this application is extremely mature. It has been in use for more than 20 years. And as I said, we continue to get great feedback from our customers to continue to improve the design and make it more and more relevant. It is running in hospitals everywhere, from small critical access hospitals to large healthcare systems. Some of the highlights of it as far as features, because we have build this on a SQL database, we have utilities that allow us to convert testing notes and release notes to import information to help you build a good project within our testing tool. We have designed some powerful test case management tools so you can build these step-by-step scripts. Our reporting allows you to really get the metrics that you need to understand what kind of testing is going on, what's been successful, where the issues are. That, of course, implies being able to consolidate and track all of the issues that you're having. We have a powerful search feature that allows you to quickly pull out things like, you know, if you have a meaningful use coordinator and they're saying to you, hey, I need to look at all of the changes that are happening in this update or in this implementation that have to do with meaningful use. How do I get that? And they would just learn how to do those queries or searches in the database and pull that information out so that they could do their own level of review and testing. We have a very popular batch update feature so that you can search for a population of related tasks and perhaps do a reassign to an individual en masse. You can identify the critical, you know, some vendors will highlight certain changes or certain workflows and say these are really the most important ones, and you could highlight those and again batch update to a higher priority, make sure those are getting done first. And I think for my money, the ability to create custom fields is extremely important. No task tracking system has the perfect design. We have all the standard fields that you would expect in a task tracking application, but being able to put in your own custom fields for things like, do we have to do training? Do we need to update documentation? Is this something that the physicians have been asking for? These are all the kinds of things that you can build into the application and that are searchable and reportable. Also, we have different levels of security, and again, I think that's really important when you want to have people engaging with the testing tool at different levels. So you'll have people that are in there doing the work and need full access to be able to update all of the tasks, but you might also have an auditor or someone in that role who needs access to what's going on in the system, but not any kind of editing capabilities. So you have the kind of the full range of those functions. So that's just a few highlights of functionality. As far as our benefits, the benefits are something articulated by our customers. The fact that we have a central database makes it really easy to access the information. The communication, because we have an email interface that's integrated in with the application, makes it really easy to do both ad hoc and rule-based emails out to individuals in the organization. Our customers tell us there's a great deal of reduction in clerical work, and perhaps as part of that, fewer hours spent in meetings, in project meetings, because a lot of the information that would be shared in meetings is, of course, available in the system and through reporting. So those are certainly things that our customers have identified. And maybe last but not least, a smoother go live, because all of these issues have been identified and tracked from beginning to end. So I will just leave it there.
Thanks, Lynn. And for everyone listening, professional services team at Iatrix Systems, we actually utilize the Array STREAMTASK application in many of our solution offerings. But just a quick background of our team, you know, we're comprised of experienced professionals that have backgrounds in project management, you know, interface programming, report writing, nursing, lab, radiology, finance. We even have, you know, those with experience as executive leaders. You know, lots of our team members have experience with, you know, as IT directors, and even in the C-suite, you know, the CIOs, COOs, and CTOs. Really, these resources can work with your team or on behalf of your team, really to just help you make more informed decisions with your EHR, your applications, or even your day-to-day workflow. We've already talked about all the services mentioned on this slide, and everything here has a hyperlink out to the documentation you can review on your own time. But really, we're just here to help you. The professional services team isn't tied to any direct IATRIC product. So if there's something in the healthcare IT domain or that maybe you're just struggling with or just need a helping hand, we're here to assist you get past those hurdles. Even some of the things not discussed on today, such as, the EHR selection and decision-making assistance, we can come in and help your organization develop your IT strategic direction. We can help you identify the best solution for your workflow that's going to yield the best return on investment. And the same is true for the technical assistance and patient identity solutions and all the other ones that aren't listed in this presentation. So in the interim, please don't hesitate to contact us with any questions, and certainly let us know when you'd like to discuss these solutions further. But at this time, we'll turn it over for a question and answer session and welcome your input through the chat window.
Thanks, Dan. So it looks like we have a couple questions to go through to start. Our first question is, if we don't have budget to hire external help, where have you seen other sites pull resources from to be successful with implementation?
Well, that's kind of a complicated question, and the reason I say that is because you can certainly obtain resources from your other hospital departments, but really you have to think of the impact. And what we've seen in the past is that most likely you're going to pull resources that are either involved in other day-to-day activities and or project activities. So by putting them into a second role, you might negatively impact the other one. So if you take them off their organizational activities and pull them into a project, you might see their organizational activities suffer, or even vice versa. But ideally, you certainly can only do with what you have. I don't know, Lynn, is there anything else you wanted to add to that?
It is a tricky one, because certainly in this day and age, I think budgeting is a big deal. It's a very real limitation, and I think, being a touchy-feely kind of person, my answer to that is you are going to have to pull from within the hospital, but if you can create a culture where that participation is valued, I think that's really important, and people will feel valued. So even though you're asking them to take on extra work or have this stress of not only trying to do their regular job, but also help out with testing, as long as I think you've created a culture like you said, Dan, pizza parties and that kind of thing, I think that goes a long way to sending a message that you think their contribution is important.
Great. Our next question is, how far in advance should testing activities begin before go live?
Oh man, these are pretty hard today. I guess honestly, as soon as possible. It certainly depends on the project. Larger projects like your EHR upgrades or migrations, there are going to be those different testing activities we talked about, where you're really just going to go through your entire timeline doing different bits and pieces of testing. So really, you can start it as soon as possible, but you really want to finish with enough time, typically maybe 1 to 2 months before your implementation. That way you have enough mitigation time to fix any issues. With those larger projects, it could be, code changes or code rewrites. Maybe there's more involvement on like third-party vendors and you have to wait on their timeline. So really, I'd say 1 month, maybe 2 months before go live. But for a smaller project, typically when you think like your interfaces, you could start as soon as, code delivery is complete. So if you have a test system, you could start right away once that's done. But you don't have to wait as long before go live to finish testing. Typically that could be done about a week before your go live. That way you just have enough time to move your code into the production environment. You think I missed anything, Lynn, on that one?
Oops, sorry, I realized my mic was off. No, I think you said it well.
Great, thank you both. We have another question. If we already have test cases or scenarios in other formats that we want to use, how would we be able to migrate those into this new solution? Asking about STREAMTASK. How will you help us do that?
I'll grab that one, Dan. I think I'm going to give you the typical vendor answer. It depends. I think when people ask us that, which they do often, we do have a very convenient import capability to take spreadsheets and import them into StreamTask as tasks. But the spreadsheet has to have certain requirements and conform to certain conventions. So usually people can modify their spreadsheets to meet the conventions that we require. So that's something. And then oftentimes, depending on the volume of test cases, it's usually a pretty, it's manual, but it's pretty easy to key these things and cut and paste and get your test cases built. And I know a lot of customers have taken that approach as well. And we certainly assist with whatever we feel would be the best approach or the best practice for you. So I think that's how I would handle it.
Thanks, Lynn. And we have time for one more question. What encouraged Upper Chesapeake or Matagorda Regional to pursue an engagement with IATRIX systems or array software in the first place?
Well, obviously, two different organizations had two different reasons. They both, however, shared the statement that they had a lack of time and a lack of resources. So from the Matagorda regional perspective, we talked about it, they just lacked the experience as well. But with Upper Chesapeake, really, they had an engagement with professional services, and we, like mentioned, used the STREAMTASK application for the testing framework. So we incorporated the web application in that engagement, and really led to them seeing all the benefits of the virtual testing and the reporting and the status tracking and everything, just managing the testing event as a whole. I think it's safe to say they both wanted a structured project management framework as well. Really, they just didn't have the time or the resources to get it done with the constraints that they had in place.
Thanks, Dan. That is it on our questions.
All right, well, thank you all. We appreciate the feedback.
Yes, thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Dan and Lynn, for a great and informative presentation. As a reminder, you can take our survey at the end of this webinar for a chance to win a $100 Amazon gift card. Don't forget to follow us on social media and check out our blogs for healthcare IT updates and to interact with your peers. If you'd like more information, contact your IATRIX Systems account executive or email info@iatric.com. Once again, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and I'd like to thank Dan and Lynn again for a wonderful presentation. I hope you all have a great day.